I have known Adrian Calloway, the Duke of Drevenmore, since we were both 17 and equally convinced that the world owed us something. I was wrong about what it owed me by the time I was 22. Adrian took considerably longer, but then he had so much more to unlearn. I tell this story not because anyone asked me to, and not because I am the most important figure in it. I am not. I am a witness, and on the best days a friend, and once, on the evening that matters most, a man who happened to be standing in the right room at the right moment, and who had the sense to keep his mouth closed and his eyes open. The room in question was a private assembly in a townhouse on Farthingale Street, and the evening was the 14th of November, in a year when London's autumn had come in early and mean. The fog had been sitting over the rooftops since the second week of October, and by mid-November it had ceased to feel like weather and had begun to feel like a judgment. It pressed against the windows of every drawing room in the city. It muffled the carriages on the cobblestones. It made every gathering feel slightly furtive, as though everyone present knew they were doing something they would prefer the rest of the world not to see. In the case of the gathering on Farthingale Street, that instinct was entirely correct. I had come as a favor, not to the host, but to a man named Whitmore, a solicitor of middling reputation who believed I might be useful in brokering a property settlement between two parties who were not disposed to be civil to one another. This was not unusual work for me. I am not a solicitor myself, but I have a talent for being the man in the room that neither side hates yet, and that has its uses. I expected to be there for 40 minutes, to drink one glass of very indifferent wine, to say a few words that both parties could interpret as agreement, and then to take myself home to my fire and my book. I had not expected Adrian. I had not expected her either, but I will come to her in a moment. The assembly was perhaps 30 people in a room that held 25 comfortably, and the smell was of tallow candles and old upholstery, and underneath it, insistent and unpleasant, the particular anxiety of men who owe more than they possess. I recognized perhaps a third of the faces. There were solicitors, minor landowners, a pair of creditors whose names I knew without having been formally introduced, and at the far end of the room, standing slightly apart from the rest as though the distance were something she had arranged deliberately, a young woman in a gray dress. Not gray in the fashionable sense, not the silvery, shimmering gray of silk that a lady of quality might choose to be interesting. This was the gray of a gown that had once been another color, possibly a quiet blue, and had been washed until the color had given up and retreated. It was clean. It was pressed. The woman wearing it had done what she could, which was considerable, but the gown itself had run out of dignity some time before the evening began. She was, I thought, somewhere in her early 20s, not beautiful in the way that makes men write poems. Her face was not that kind of face. It was a precise face, a still face. Her dark hair was dressed simply, close to her head, with no ornamentation. Her hands were folded in front of her, and they were not trembling, which I noted, because every other person in that room was in some state of visible discomfort, and she was not. She was watching the proceedings with an expression I can only describe as contained, the way a woman looks when she has decided, somewhere behind her eyes, that she will not allow what is happening to reach her. I did not know who she was yet. I turned to find Whitmore. He found me first, and he was not wearing the expression of a man about to discuss property settlements. He was wearing the expression of a man who has realized he is in deeper water than he intended, and who is now looking for someone taller to stand behind. "Holt," he said, too quietly, "I am glad you're here. The situation has become somewhat more complicated than I indicated in my letter." "How complicated?" He glanced toward the far end of the room, toward the woman in the gray dress. "Sir Aldous Brackett," he said, "has run through the last of his assets." I knew Brackett by reputation. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the complexion of someone who had spent several decades negotiating with his conscience and winning every battle while losing every war. He had been, at various points, a landowner, a speculator, and a guardian. This last role acquired when a distant cousin had died without closer family and left a ward and a modest inheritance to Brackett's care. The ward, as I had now surmised, was the woman at the end of the room. "He intends to settle his accounts tonight," Whitmore continued, and his voice had gone even quieter, as though volume itself were a kind of complicity. "The inheritance is gone, spent, or near enough. The creditors have agreed to accept a marriage settlement in lieu of the outstanding note. Whoever discharges the debt takes on, that is, whoever takes the girl in marriage satisfies the claim." I looked at him. He had the grace to look wretched. "He is going to offer her," I said. "It was not a question. He has already told the room what is on the table." I looked back at her. She was still standing in the same place. Still folded hands, still contained, still watching. Only now I understood what she was watching, and I understood why she had arranged that precise distance between herself and the rest of the gathering, and I felt something cold and clean and entirely useless settle in my chest, which was the feeling of a man who has arrived too late to prevent a thing and must now decide what to do in its aftermath. "She knows," I said. "She has been told. She came, she would not stay at home. Brackett apparently told her it would be better for her to remain at the townhouse, but she refused. She said she would see it." I thought that was either the bravest thing I had ever heard or the most heartbreaking, and I could not decide which, and I thought perhaps it was both simultaneously. Then the door at the far end of the room opened, and Adrian Calloway walked in. He was not supposed to be there. He had no business on Farthingale Street. He had been, to my knowledge, attending to an entirely different matter that evening, something to do with an entail dispute on his Kentish property, and I had assumed he would be closeted with his own solicitors until midnight. I could not have told you then why he had come, and I am not sure he could have told you either. Sometimes a man changes course for reasons that his better self has intuited before his reasoning mind has caught up. Sometimes a man simply turns down a different street. He came in alone, which was unusual. Adrian generally had at least one person attending him, not because he required it, but because the Duke of Devonmore moving through London without a retinue tended to create a kind of social vacuum that other people rushed to fill. He was not a man you ignored. He was tall, and he carried himself with the absolute physical economy of someone who has never in his life been uncertain about where he was allowed to stand. His coat was dark. He rarely wore anything else, and his expression when he entered the room was the one I knew best, which was the expression of a man who has decided not to feel anything about his surroundings until he has assessed them. The room noticed him immediately. That was always the way. The conversations didn't stop. They just went quieter and people shifted and eyes moved. The Duke of Devonmore was not a comfortable presence. He was not meant to be. He swept the room with a look. It passed over the creditors, over Whitmore, over Brackett, and then it stopped. It stopped at the woman in the gray dress. I had known Adrian for 22 years, which meant I had watched him look at a great many things, at landscapes and enemies and political adversaries, and on one or two memorable occasions, at women who had taken his attention. I knew what his attention looked like. It was swift and complete, like a door closing. You would not necessarily notice it if you were watching him the way most people did watching his face for warmth or approachability, which they rarely found. But I knew what to look for, and what I saw in that moment was not the usual efficient assessment. It was something slower, something that, in another man, I would have called arrested. He stopped moving for a moment that was just slightly too long to be ordinary. Then he looked away and crossed the room toward Brackett, because Brackett had come forward, and Adrian had presumably come here for whatever business had brought him to Farthingale Street. A debt of his own, perhaps, owed to one of the creditors, which he intended to discharge before the evening grew messy. But I had seen his face. and I watched where his eyes went once, twice, in the next few minutes, while Brackett was speaking to him and Adrian was appearing to pay attention. They went back to her, both times. Brackett cleared his throat and addressed the room. He was not, I will say, a man who enjoyed what he was doing. There was no performance of it, no showman's relish. He was a man who had run out of other options and had decided that the path of least resistance was the only path left, and he delivered his proposal with the flat affect of someone reciting a bill of sale. The note against his estates was significant. He was unable to meet it by any conventional means. His ward, Miss Corinna Vale, was 23, of sound health and good character, and came with his assurance that she was, he paused here, and the pause was the worst thing in the room, of good reputation and unspoilt. The man who discharged the debt by morning would take her in a proper marriage, witnessed and bound. Any interested party was to make his intentions known before the creditors departed at 11 o'clock. He finished speaking. The room was very quiet. I looked at Corinna Vale. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded. Her expression had not changed, that same quality of containment, of watching from behind something. But there was a line, very fine, along her jaw that had not been there before, a line that I recognized as the visible trace of something held very hard, something that was not going to be allowed out, not in this room, not in front of these men. I thought I should go to her. I thought she needed. I did not know what she needed. I was not certain there was anything I could offer that was large enough for this particular moment. And then Adrian Calloway spoke. He had been standing at the edge of the group nearest Brackett, and he had not moved during the recitation, and his expression had given nothing away. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He never did. There was rarely any need, because the room always adjusted to him. "What is the figure?" he said. Brackett told him. Adrian considered this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he named a number. It was the debt, plus, I am not exaggerating, nearly twice again the debt, in what he described as settlement of all claims against the Brackett estate, in full, no further claims to be brought against any party. The note retired entirely and permanently. The room made the collective sound of men recalibrating. Brackett looked at him with an expression that was part relief and part confusion, because the amount was more than was required, and men who offer more than is required generally want something beyond what is stated. "The girl," Adrian said, and I noted, and I think Brackett noted, and I suspect several other men in the room noted, that he said it without the particular inflection of a purchaser acquiring property. He said it the way a man says a word he has been thinking about for several minutes and has finally permitted himself to speak aloud. "You said she goes with the settlement." "That was the arrangement, yes." "Then the arrangement is accepted." He glanced toward Corinna then directly, for the first time, and without the sideways discretion he had been practicing for the last several minutes. "She is not your ward any longer after tonight. She is not anyone's property. She will come to Drevenmore as a ward of the estate until she has had the time and the resources to arrange her own future. If at that point she has any inclination toward a different arrangement." He stopped for a moment, and the pause was not Brackett's empty pause. It was a different thing entirely, a pause that knew what it was doing. She need only say so. He looked at me then. I have been the Duke of Drevenmore's closest friend for 22 years, and in that time he has asked me to perform any number of tasks, some of them considerably more complicated than others. The look he gave me now was the particular look that said, "Please come and deal with whatever needs to be dealt with, and please do it efficiently." I crossed the room to Corinna Vale. She was looking at him. Not at me, at him. And her expression had changed, because there was no longer any way to maintain the containment in full. Something had come through the careful wall of it, and what had come through was not gratitude exactly, and it was not relief exactly, and it was not trust, because she had been given no reason to trust anyone in this room and she knew it. What had come through was something more careful than any of those things. It was the expression of a woman who is listening very hard to something and refusing to let herself believe it yet. "Miss Vale," I said, "I am Lord Everard Holt. I am a friend of the Duke's. I want to tell you that nothing is required of you tonight except to come with me, and that if there is anything that you need, anything at all, a letter sent to someone, a moment before we leave, you have only to say it." She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and they were very direct, and they made a swift and thorough assessment of my face before she answered. "Is he always this?" she began, and then she stopped and glanced toward Adrian, who was still on the other side of the room directing a conversation with Brackett and the lead creditor that appeared to be going very efficiently in the direction of completion. She looked back at me. "Is he always like that?" I thought about this. "Yes," I said, "though usually not quite so immediately." Something crossed her face that was very nearly a smile, and then it went back to where it had come from. "I have a small trunk at the townhouse on Claverton Lane," she said. "That is all I have. I would like it sent for if that's possible." "It will be arranged by morning," I said. "Then I am ready," she said, and she said it with the quiet finality of a woman closing a door she has no intention of reopening, and she turned from the room on Farthingale Street and did not look back at it. I will say this for her. She went without looking at Brackett, not with the theatrical dignity of deliberate avoidance. She simply did not look at him, the way you do not look at a thing that no longer exists in any way that matters. The Duke of Drevenmore's primary country seat was 3 hours from London on good roads, and the roads that November were not good. We reached the estate on the second day, having stayed overnight at an inn in Blackwater, where the landlady had shown Coroner Vale to the best room without being asked, and had looked at me with the kind of expression that clearly indicated I should continue to be useful or remove myself from the corridor. I removed myself from the corridor. On the second morning, driving the last hour to Drevenmore through a landscape that had gone from fog to frost overnight, I sat in the carriage with Coroner and tried, as I have tried with very few people in my life, to say something worth saying. She did not make it easy. Not because she was cold, she was not cold as I was learning. She was watchful, which is a different thing entirely. She had a way of sitting in silence that was not passive. It was active, attentive. She was listening to things beyond the immediate conversation, including, I suspected, to her own conclusions about everything she was encountering. "The Duke," she said at last, when we were perhaps 15 minutes from the gates. "I should know something about him if I am to be, whatever I am to be, in his house." "What would you like to know?" "What does he want from this?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I do not think he knows yet," I said, which was honest. "He is not a man who generally acts before he has reasoned himself to a conclusion. Last night was not, it was not typical." She thought about this. "Is he good?" It is not the question most people ask. Most people ask whether he is kind or whether he is fair, or occasionally whether he is dangerous, which he is, though not in the way they imagine. She had asked whether he was good, which is a harder question and a more important one. "Yes," I said, "he is good. He is not easy and he is not always patient, and there is a coldness in him when he does not yet trust, but he is good underneath all of it. He has always been good underneath all of it." She nodded once, as though this were data to be filed and returned to. "What should I know about the estate?" she asked. "It runs well. He has a steward named Gareth who has been there 40 years and knows every stone of the place. The household is loyal. They have been with him a long time. They will not be unkind to you. They will be cautious until they know you, and then they will not be cautious." "And you?" "I will be back in London by Thursday," I said, "but I am easily written to and I come when I am wanted. Consider me a friend of the house, and therefore of you if that is useful." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are kind," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested she was not entirely certain what to do with kindness, which was the most heartbreaking thing she had said yet, and she had not meant it to be heartbreaking at all. The gates of Drevenmore appeared through the frost, and she looked at them, and her expression was very still, and I thought she was doing the thing she had been doing on Farthingale Street, holding something very carefully in place, not allowing it to reach her until she had determined whether it was safe. Adrian met us at the entrance himself, which he did not do as a rule, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Callum, who had been running the domestic side of Drevenmore for 17 years, stood at his right shoulder and looked at Coroner Vale with an expression that I recognized as professional assessment, passing through to provisional approval in the space of about 30 seconds. "Miss Vale," Adrian said. His voice was what it always was, even low, not given to performance. "The East Wing rooms are prepared for you. Mrs. Callum will see to whatever you need. You are not a guest in the way that requires you to be on your best behavior, and you are not a servant. The house is yours to use as you wish. I have no expectations of you beyond," he paused briefly, "beyond whatever you find comfortable." She looked at him for a moment. I watched her watching him, and I watched him watching her watch him, and I thought, well, this is going to be something. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I should warn you, I have a tendency to find libraries comfortable." Something moved in his face. Not a smile, Adrian very rarely smiled in that open way, but there was a quality of attention in it, a quickening of something that had been still. "The library is entirely at your disposal," he said. She nodded and went with Mrs. Callum, and Adrian stood watching the door through which she had gone for a moment that was, again, just slightly too long to be ordinary. "Well," I said, because I felt that someone should say something. "Go back to London, Everard," he said, not unkindly. "I am going," I said. "I merely observe that you are watching the door." "I am observing the architectural merits of the doorframe," he said, and went inside. I went back to London on Thursday, and I wrote to him on Sunday, and his reply came on Wednesday, and it was 3 pages long, which was unusual for a man who generally confined himself to useful information. 2.5 of those pages were useful information. Estate matters, the settlement with Brackett's creditors completed, the legal arrangements for Corona's independent status now formalized, so that no one could revisit the claim. He had also, I noted, arranged for a seamstress to come from the village, and for funds to be made available to Miss Vale for whatever she required, through Mrs. Callum, without any of it being discussed in a way that would make her feel it was charity. Half a page, at the very end, contained the information that she had found his copy of Blackwood's estate management surveying in the library, and had apparently read a third of it before he had found her there the previous evening, and had informed him, upon being startled, that his south drainage system had a flaw in the layout that would cost him considerably in the spring if it was not corrected, and she had sketched the correction in the margin. "I had Gareth look at it," Adrian wrote. "She was right." I sat with that letter for a long time, and then I wrote back, "Tell me more about the drainage system." He did not, because he understood what I meant, but his next letter was 4 pages. The weeks passed. I came to Drevenmore twice before December, once on legitimate business, once on the excuse of legitimate business. On both visits I watched. What I watched was not a romance in the conventional sense of the word. There was no performance of it, no pointed meetings in rose gardens, no dramatic encounters in candle-lit corridors. What I watched was something quieter, and I thought, considerably more durable than most of what passed for the conventional thing. I watched Coroner Vale learn the house. She did it the way she did everything, carefully, without announcing herself. She knew the name of every servant within the first week. She spent an afternoon with Gareth, the old steward, going over the Southfield accounts, and Gareth, who had been managing things since before Adrian was born and was not given to opinions about guests, told Mrs. Callum that she had a head for land that would put most gentlemen to shame. I watched Adrian watch her. He was not obvious about it. He was never obvious about anything. But I knew him, and I knew the signs. The way the conversation at dinner consistently oriented toward whatever she had said last. The way he appeared in the library at hours when he was not normally in the library. The particular quality of his attention when she was in a room, which was the quality of a compass needle that has found north and keeps returning to it even when the compass is pointed elsewhere. There was a morning, I was there for this, when they were both at the breakfast table, and she was reading something she had brought down with her, and he was making a systematic effort to read his correspondence, and neither of them was paying attention to their eggs, and Mrs. Callum came in and went out again, and I saw her hide something that was very nearly a smile behind her professional expression. She was not, I want to be clear, helpless in any of this. She had none of the flutter and performance of the drawing room. She did not defer to him out of anxiety. She deferred when he knew more than she did. And she did not when she knew more than he did, which was not infrequently. And she told him so in a direct, dry way that managed to be entirely respectful and entirely unintimidated simultaneously. He loved it. I could see him loving it in real time, which was something I had not expected to witness in my lifetime. There was an evening in December, about 5 weeks after her arrival, when a small gathering came to Drevenmore, 4 of Adrian's neighbors, people of the county, decent people, curious. I sat and watched the room navigate its uncertainty about who Corinna Vale was and what she was doing there. The questions were careful, the smiles careful. She answered everything with the same precise, watchful quality, giving nothing she had not decided to give. And there was never a moment when anyone could have said she had put a foot wrong, and there was also never a moment when anyone could have said they had gotten anything past her, which I suspect was the more important thing. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Adrian and I were sitting in the library with the fire going down and Corinna had gone upstairs, he said, "She handled that well." "She handled it masterfully," I said. He looked at the fire. "She should not have to handle it at all," he said, and there was something in his voice that I had not heard in a very long time, something with heat in it, a real heat, not the professional displeasure he wore as easily as his coat, but something personal and sharp. "No," I said, "she should not." He was quiet for a moment. "When I am in a room with her," he said, "the room becomes a different room than it is when she is not in it." I said nothing. I was experienced enough in our friendship to recognize when my role was to exist, not to speak. "I am not in the habit of this is not something I have." He stopped. This was unusual. Adrian was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He picked up his glass, put it down again. "She has spine, Everard. She has more spine than anyone I have ever been in a room with, and she carries it as though it cost nothing, but I think it costs quite a lot." "I think it has always cost quite a lot," I said. "Yes," he looked at the fire again. "Yes." That was December. What came in January was colder and worse, in the way that January generally is, and what made it worse was not the weather. It was Brackett. Sir Aldous Brackett had, since the night of the Farthingale Street Assembly, retreated into his own diminishment. The settlement Adrian had arranged had cleared his debts, but it had not cleared his reputation, which had quietly deteriorated since the autumn. What he retained, in the absence of money or standing, was the particular bitterness of a man who has been made small by his own choices, and has decided that the fault lies elsewhere. Elsewhere in his telling was the Duke of Drevenmore. I heard about it first through Whitmore, who heard it through the creditor circles. That Brackett was speaking in certain rooms about the arrangement at Farthingale Street. He was not describing it accurately. He was describing a duke who had paid for a woman and taken her to his country estate, and what could one call such an arrangement, when you were being honest among friends, which of course one always was. The version that traveled, as versions do, with the particular efficiency that London social circles reserve for things that are salacious, which is to say that it moved very quickly and arrived everywhere slightly more salacious than it had departed, was that Miss Corinna Vale was the Duke of Drevenmore's kept woman, maintained in comfort at the country estate, which explained both his extravagant generosity and her presence there, and which anyone with common sense could have predicted. I heard about it on a Tuesday. I wrote to Adrian on Wednesday. His reply came Friday, and it was 1 page, and it was not in his usual even register. He had heard it. He was, he wrote, consulting with his solicitor about what recourse existed. He was also, he wrote, considering whether Corinna would be better served by returning to London, where she could be established in proper lodgings under appropriate chaperonage, which would make her situation unambiguous and would separate her from the connection with his name that was giving the rumor its fuel. He was going to send her away. He meant it as protection. I knew him well enough to know that, and I knew him well enough to know that it was costing him considerably, and I knew him well enough to know that he was entirely wrong. I wrote back immediately, not yet, talk to her first. He did not reply for 2 days, which suggested he was either taking the advice or building up to ignoring it. On the 3rd day, I received a letter that said only, "I have written to a Mrs. Cartwright in Kensington who would provide appropriate lodgings. I am composing the letter to Corinna now." I was in my carriage for Drevenmore within the hour. I was not in time. She had apparently found the letter on his desk. She had been in his study looking for a map of the South Field, because the drainage correction had led her to consider the entire eastern boundary, and she had an idea about it, and the study was where the maps were kept, and she had not expected anyone to be in there. He had not expected her, and the letter was on the desk in his handwriting, and she had apparently read the first 3 paragraphs before he appeared in the doorway. I know all of this because by the time I arrived, it had happened, and Mrs. Callum told me in the entrance hall with the precise economy of a woman who understood exactly how much information was necessary, and not a syllable more. I found them in the drawing room. The drawing room at Drevenmore is not a small room. It is the room in which the Duke of Drevenmore receives visitors, which means it is arranged to communicate, at a glance, exactly how consequential the Duke of Drevenmore is. The ceilings are high. The furnishings are significant. The fireplace is large enough to stand in, and the fire in it was burning well, and the 2 people standing at opposite ends of the room were conducting themselves with the stillness of 2 people who have recently said things that cannot be unsaid. Corinna was standing near the window. She was not looking out of it. She was looking at Adrian with the expression she had first worn on Farthingale Street, the contained one, the held very tightly one, but there was something different in it now. On Farthingale Street, the containment had been the containment of a woman protecting herself from the immediate wound. What I saw now was something older and more careful, the containment of a woman who has decided, very precisely, what she is willing to accept and what she is not. In her hand was a piece of paper. She had not put it down. Adrian was standing at the other end of the room, and he had his back to the fire, and his expression was the one he wore when he was holding himself very deliberately in check. Jaw set, eyes steady, the quality of a man who has decided to be reasonable even though he is not feeling reasonable. "Miss Vale," I said, because someone had to say something. She looked at me. Her eyes were very dark and very direct, exactly as they had been the night I first met her, and she said, "Lord Holt, I am glad you have come, though I suspect you will have come too late." "Too late for what?" I said. "To tell me I am wrong," she said, "or to tell him he is right. I am not sure which thing you would have come to do, but I suspect neither of them is possible now." "What," I said carefully, "do you believe is in dispute?" She held up the paper, not theatrically, simply. "He intends to send me away. He has found me lodgings." "I intend to protect your reputation," Adrian said. His voice was even. It was the evenness of a man working hard to maintain it. By removing me, she said. By separating you from the association with. By removing me, she said again, with a quietness that was somehow louder than anything she could have said otherwise. You purchased my freedom from one man who decided where I should live, and I am grateful for it. I am genuinely grateful, and I have tried to show that in whatever way I could, and I think you know that I have not sat here as a passive debt to be discharged. I have tried to be of use. I have tried to build something here that has substance. And now there is difficulty, and the answer is again a man deciding that it is better if I am somewhere else, and I find. She stopped. She was not going to cry. I was quite certain she was not going to cry. I find that I am not willing to be somewhere else, not because of pride, because I have built something here that another stop, a breath that was very carefully managed. I am not willing to go. If you wish me gone, you must say so. Say it because you want me gone, not because it is the sensible arrangement. There was a silence in the room that felt, to me, very large. Adrian was looking at her. I want to try to describe how he was looking at her, because it is the thing I remember most clearly from that day, more clearly than anything else. He was looking at her the way I had seen him look at problems that mattered, the deep, complete attention he brought to things he intended to get right, that left no part of the question uninspected. But it was not a problem's look. There was nothing of assessment in it. What there was, and I am aware that I am describing something in the face of the Duke of Drevenmore that most of London would consider impossible, was something open. Something that had stopped defending itself. He said her name. Not her title, not Miss Vale, her name. I will not write it here because it was not mine to hear, but it was the first time he had said it, and she heard the difference immediately. I watched her hear it, the very slight change in how she was holding herself. I do not want you gone, he said. I have not wanted you gone since the morning after you arrived, when I came into the library and found the Blackwoods open on the reading table, and I thought for a moment that you had left, and something happened that was, he paused, and it was not an empty pause, not comfortable. She was very still. I want to say to you, he said, that what Brackett is saying is not what I believe anyone of substance will credit, and that I have means to address it that do not require you to leave. I want to say to you that what I put in that letter was the most reasonable course I could identify, which does not make it the right one, and that if I had the choice between the most reasonable course and whatever you are willing to allow. Another pause, and this one was a different kind, the kind that a man makes when he has come to the edge of something and is deciding whether to step. I would take whatever you are willing to allow, without condition, without expectation of. I am not trying to purchase anything, Corina. I want to be very plain about that. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I know. Do you? I knew the night you said I was not anyone's property, she said. I knew it on the road here, and I knew it when I arrived, and I have known it every day since. That is not, she stopped again, and the look on her face was the most unguarded I had ever seen it, the careful containment coming apart at the edges with something that was not grief and not relief, but some complicated combination of the two. That is not why I tore the letter. I tore it because I did not want to leave. That is the entire reason. I did not want to leave. The paper was still in her hand. She looked at it, and then she let it go, and it fell into the fire, and we all three of us watched it take the flame, and then it was gone. I thought that was probably the appropriate moment to be somewhere else. I found Mrs. Callum in the corridor. She was walking toward the kitchen with an expression of serene preoccupation that did not deceive me for a moment. Mrs. Callum, I said. My lord, she said. I believe the drawing room may not require interruption for the next little while. I had absolutely no intention of interrupting the drawing room, my lord, she said, with perfect composure. Excellent, I said. Shall I have your usual room made up? Please. I thought you might be staying, she said, and continued toward the kitchen, and I stood in the corridor for a moment feeling, not for the first time in this story, that the women in this house were considerably ahead of everyone else. What happened between them in that drawing room I do not know and did not ask. I know that when I came to dinner that evening, both of them were at the table, and that the quality of the air between them had changed, had become something easier, something that had resolved from tension into a different state, less taut, more warm. She had put the contained expression away entirely, or at least had allowed something past it, and he was talking to her in a way that was not the careful, metered way of the preceding weeks, but something with less architecture around it, something more direct. They were talking about the drainage system. He was listening to her with the attention of a man who has decided that what the other person is saying is the thing he most wants to hear, and she was talking with the unself-conscious fluency of someone who has stopped managing how she appears and is simply present. I ate my dinner and said very little and felt thoroughly, privately glad. Brackett came in February. He came unannounced, which was not, I should say, a wise decision, and he came with a friend, a man named Corver, of the kind of legal background that suggested he had been brought along to lend an air of formality to what was in fact a personal mission of recrimination. I was not there when he arrived. I was in London. I heard the account from Gareth, the steward, who had been in the front hall when the carriage appeared, and who had 40 years of practice at communicating events with a straight face and a tone of absolute neutrality that somehow conveyed everything. Brackett had come, by Gareth's account, in a mood to be heard. He had come with the air of a man who had been building up to something for some time and was now prepared to deliver it. He had asked for the Duke and been told that the Duke was in the South Field. He had then asked whether Miss Vale was at home, and had been told that he would need to wait in the front hall while Gareth determined whether anyone was receiving. He had waited approximately 6 minutes. Then Coroner Vale had come down the stairs. I was not there for this, and I regret it sincerely, but I have it from Gareth and from Mrs. Callum and from the footman who was in the hall, and the accounts agree with one another closely enough that I am comfortable with what I am about to write. She came down the stairs in a gown that was not the gray gown from Farthingale Street. It was a dark blue, good cloth, well fitted, the quality of a woman who has had the resources and the time to present herself as she chose. She had her hair dressed properly. She looked, by all accounts, as the daughter of a good house ought to look, which she was, whatever Brackett had made of her circumstances. She came down and she looked at him and she said, "Sir Aldous." He had clearly expected to unseat her. He had clearly come expecting the anxious girl from Farthingale Street, or at minimum the wary newcomer of early December. He had come expecting to have the advantage. The expression on his face when he saw her, Gareth reported, was the expression of a man whose calculations have gone wrong at the first step. She said, "I will speak to you in the hall, since you have come without being invited, and I do not choose to take you further into the house." "What is it you want?" He said, and I understand why he said it, which is that he was off balance and reaching for the thing he had prepared, that he had come to speak to the Duke about the arrangement and certain questions about its propriety. "The Duke," said Coroner, "is not here at this moment, and the arrangement requires no defense from him or from me, since it is a legal and documented guardianship that any solicitor can examine at any time." She paused. "If you have come to repeat what you have been saying in London, I suggest you consider carefully before doing so. I am not the girl you sold at Farthingale Street any longer. I have a name and a standing and people who will defend both, and if you continue to speak as you have been speaking, those people will not be passive about it." Brackett apparently drew himself up. He apparently said something to the effect that she had no standing to, that she was, regardless of the Duke's patronage. "Sir Aldous," she said, "go home." She said it, Gareth told me, with the absolute finality of a woman who has decided this conversation is over, and the decision is irreversible, and the only remaining question is whether the person being dismissed will have the dignity to leave under their own power. He left under his own power. Corver, who had not said a word throughout, went with him with what Gareth described as a look of quiet relief. Adrian came in from the south field about 20 minutes later and was told what had occurred. He stood in the entrance hall and listened to Gareth's account with complete stillness. Then he went to find Corina, who was, by then, in the library with her book. I do not know what he said to her. I know what he told me later in a letter, that he had found her in the library and that she had looked up from her book, and that before he could speak she had said, "He is gone, and it is handled, and I do not want to discuss it," and had returned to her book. He had stood in the library doorway, he wrote, for a considerable time. Then he had gone and sat in his chair, not at the desk, but in the reading chair near the fire, the one that was across from where she sat, and picked up whatever was to hand, which happened to be a 3-month-old copy of a farming gazette, and read it. They had sat like that for an hour, he wrote. He had not spoken, and she had not spoken, and at the end of the hour she had looked up from her book and said, with the particular dry precision that he had come, in the preceding months, to regard as one of the fundamental pleasures of his existence, "The gazette you are reading is from October." "I know," he had said. "You have read the same page 6 times." "I know." She had looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for coming in," she had said, and then she had gone back to her book. He had written me 4 pages about this. 4 pages about sitting in a library reading a farming gazette from October. I read them all twice, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing. There is the man I have known for 22 years, finally arrived at something real. The formal announcement came in March. Not an engagement, not yet. There were still things to arrange, and Corina was not a woman who would be hurried toward a decision, and Adrian was not a man who would hurry her. What came in March was a gathering at Drevenmore, a dinner, 20 people, the county's significant figures and 3 or 4 from London who mattered, and it was understood by everyone present that it was a statement. I was there. I want to be clear that I was there for all of it, for the dinner itself, for the moment at the end of the evening that I am about to describe, and for the particular expression on the face of Sir Aldous Brackett, who had been invited, not by Corina, not by Adrian, but by the neighbor who had sat between them on 2 previous occasions and had not known the history, and had extended the invitation in perfect innocence, and who had been quietly horrified when informed of the situation, but had had no way to retract. Brackett came. He sat at the far end of the table, and he was very quiet throughout dinner, and I watched him watching Corina Vale, who was seated 3 places to Adrian's right, and was conducting herself with the complete, unperformative assurance of a woman entirely at home. And I watched him recalibrate everything he had been telling himself about what this situation was. She did not look at him. She talked to the woman on her left about the estate's winter crops. She talked to the man on her right about a book he had mentioned in passing the previous autumn. She told a story, dry and precise, about a drainage correction she had proposed that had turned out to be entirely correct, and had been received by the estate's steward with the particular expression of a man determined to seem unsurprised. The table laughed. Adrian, seated at the head, watched her from 3 places away with an expression that was no longer careful about what it contained. After dinner, when the party had moved into the drawing room and the conversations had loosened into the easier social traffic of the later evening, I found myself standing near the window with my wine and a view of the room. I watched Adrian cross toward Corina, not urgently, not with any performance, simply the way a man moves toward the thing that draws him. She was talking with a woman from the neighboring estate, and she saw him coming before he reached her, and something in her expression adjusted. Not the containment, not the careful held quality, but an openness, a turning toward, the way a plant turns toward the light without thinking about it. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, between her and the room beside her. It was a very small choice, and it said everything. The woman Coroner had been talking to was not, it turned out, unobservant. She glanced between them, said something graceful about needing to find her husband, and withdrew with the discretion of a woman who recognizes a moment and respects it. Adrian said something to Coroner. I was too far to hear it. She tipped her head slightly toward him, that precise, attentive listening I had come to recognize, and then she said something back, and he said something more, and then she looked at him in that direct, dark-eyed way, and what crossed her face was not the contained expression, not the watchful expression, not any of the careful expressions I had learned over the preceding months. It was simply her, fully present, fully arrived, looking at him with the undisguised clarity of a woman who has made her decision. At the far end of the room, I saw Brackett watching this. I saw the moment he understood what he was watching. I saw him understand that the girl he had stood up in front of a room of creditors and described as something to be sold. That girl was standing beside the Duke of Drevenmore in the Duke of Drevenmore's drawing room, while the county's most significant figures moved comfortably around her, and the Duke of Drevenmore was looking at her as though the room would stop making sense without her in it. I do not know what Brackett was expecting. Perhaps he had expected her to remain diminished, because that was the story he had told himself and told others, and it was a story that required her diminishment to remain true. Perhaps he had expected the arrangement to collapse under its own implausibility, because men like Brackett often believe that the natural order of things runs in their favor, and what is natural tends to reassert itself. She was not diminished. She was the least diminished person in the room. I watched him stand there for a moment, and then I watched him put down his glass and say his quiet, early goodbyes and leave. I have not seen him since. The engagement was announced in April. I heard it first from Adrian himself, in a letter that was considerably shorter than most of the letters I had received from him in the preceding months. 6 lines. He had asked her, the previous Tuesday afternoon in the library, where else, with what I gathered was minimal preamble and considerable sincerity, and she had said yes, and then she had said, I want you to know that I would have said yes without the estate and without the standing and without any of it. I want you to know that what I am saying yes to is you. He wrote that she had gone back to her book after saying this, in the way she did when she had said the important thing, and considered further elaboration unnecessary, and he had sat across from her for the rest of the afternoon reading a book he could not later name, and he had felt, he wrote, like a man who has been in the cold for a very long time and has found the door that he did not know he was looking for. And the warmth inside it was so entirely what he had not known, he needed that he could not quite believe it was real, and then she had looked up from her book and said, without any particular emphasis, You are doing the Gazette thing again, and he had understood that it was real. I wrote back, I know. I saw it at Farthingale Street. He did not reply to that, which I took as agreement. They were married in June, at Drevenmore, in the chapel attached to the east wing that had not been used in 8 years, and which Mrs. Callum had spent 6 weeks quietly restoring to a standard she considered appropriate for the occasion. The service was small, not because there was any reason for secrecy, but because neither of them wanted the spectacle, and the county came anyway to the celebration after, filling the lawns in the June light and eating rather a lot of the estate's good food. I stood with Adrian before the service began. He was very still in the way he became still when something mattered to him. He was not anxious. He was not, as far as I could observe, any flavor of uncertain. He was the stillness of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended to be and is allowing himself, for a moment, to understand that. You watched it from the beginning, he said. I was in the room, I said. On Farthingale Street. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What did you think when you saw her? I thought about this, because it was worth thinking about. I thought she was holding something very carefully in place, I said, and I thought she had been holding it for a very long time and was very tired of it, and that if someone gave her the room to put it down, she would put it down and there would be something remarkable underneath it. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man absorbing something. "And you?" I asked. He looked toward the chapel door. "I thought the room had changed," he said, "and I did not yet know why." She came through the door on the arm of Gareth, the old steward, who had been in service at Drevenmore for 40 years and who had been asked, by Corina herself, because she had no family she wished to claim and no guardian she wished to acknowledge, and because she had observed, in the months at the estate, that Gareth was a man of absolute integrity and quiet decency, and those were the things she valued. He walked her through the chapel with the careful precision of a man taking extreme care not to be inadequate to the occasion, and she walked beside him in a gown that was nothing like the gray dress from Farthingale Street. It was ivory, clean, fitted to someone who had put the threadbare year entirely behind her, and she walked with the quality I had first noticed the night I met her. A contained dignity that was not performance, that had always been hers, that had survived everything. She looked at Adrian when she reached him. He looked at her, and I watched 22 years of the most feared man in the county stand in a small chapel in the June light and look at the woman who had torn his carefully managed letter into the fire, who had sent his ward's former guardian out of his own entrance hall with nothing but the authority of a woman who knows exactly where she stands, who had corrected his drainage system in the margins of his own book and been entirely right about it, and who had sat across from him in the library for months saying the things that needed to be said with the precision of someone who does not spend words unless they are the right ones. And I watched him put his hand out, and I watched her take it, and I watched something in both of them settle. The way a room settles when the last door closes and the wind is shut outside, and the warmth inside becomes simply the truth. Mrs. Callum, standing 3 rows back, permitted herself an expression that was entirely unguarded. I saw it happen and I thought, 17 years of running the house, and this is what she chose to show her face for. I find that exactly right. I have known Adrian Calloway, the Duke of Drevenmore, since we were both 17, and I have watched him become, in the years since, a man of considerable force and very few softnesses. I watched him become that, and I thought I knew the whole of what he was. I was wrong. I knew the considerable force. I did not know what he would be when someone gave him a reason to let the force rest and be simply a man. I did not know what Corina Vale would be when she put down the things she had been carrying for so long, the exhausting, careful architecture of a woman who has been traded and overlooked and dismissed, and found herself in a place where she was simply known. She changed the room. That is what he said the morning after Farthingale Street. He had not known why then. I think he knows now. She changed every room she walked into, quietly, without announcing it. She changed this one most of all. I was in the room when it began. I am glad. I would not have missed it for anything in the world.